Today I'm very excited. This event has a lot of meaning to me. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I think I grew up in literature and now here working for the publishing industry, seeing the lack of representation of Latinx Caribbean voices. So when I was here and we were thinking about we were thinking about Hispanic Heritage Month, I said, we have to have the voices that need to be heard the most. And luckily, I have these two amazing writers here that I'm a fan of their work and who they are as people as well. So we're having today this Latinx Caribbean Heritage panel with Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa, an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, and Carmen Rita Wong. Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa was born in Puerto Rico and raised in New York City. She is a product of the Puerto Rican communities in the island and in the South Bronx. As a child, she was sent to live with her grandparents in Puerto Rico, where she was introduced to the culture of rural Puerto Rico, including the storytelling that came naturally to the woman in her family, especially the older woman. Much of her work is based on her experiences during this time. Llanos-Figueroa taught creative writing, language, and literature in the New York City school system before becoming a young adult librarian and writer. The hardcover edition of Daughters of the Stone was shortlisted as a 2010 finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her second novel, A Woman of Endurance, was released in April 2022, and the Spanish language edition, Indómita, releases in May 2022. I love the title for the book. Her short stories have been published in anthologies and literary magazines such as Breaking Ground, Anthology of Puerto Rican Women Writers in New York from 1980 to 2012, Growing Up Girl, Afro-Hispanic Review, Pleaides, Latino Book Review, Label Me Latina, and Kweli Journal. She lives in New York City. We will be discussing today her work. Her latest book, A Woman of Endurance, is a novel that illuminates a little discussed aspect of history, the Puerto Rican Atlantic slave trade, witnessed through the experiences of Pola, an African captive used as a breeder to bear more slaves. Carmen Rita Wong is a writer and author of the memoir, Why Didn't You Tell Me? She is a producer and nonprofit board leader, including the boards of the Moth and the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She is the former co-creator and television host of On the Money on CNBC and was national advice columnist for Glamour, Latina, Essence, Men's Health, and Good Housekeeping, as well as a former faculty professor at NYU. Carmen is the author of a series of novels and 2 best-selling advice books. She is the founder and CEO of Malecon Productions, LLC, where she develops female-focused media and entertainment. She lives in Manhattan with her daughter and their 2 pups. Why Didn't You Tell Me? Is a memoir about family secrets, the immigrant experience, race, and identity, and that's the one we're going to be discussing today. So if you can help me receive them with an applause. These chairs are quite complicated. Okay. Well, welcome again. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very happy to have you both here, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I think your books are very different books, but they have many things in common at the same time, particularly the Latinx Caribbean experience in different times in history. But I believe, as I mentioned before, that representation matters. And for me, seeing our food, our culture, our traditions the good, the bad, and the ugly was a beautiful experience when I was reading your book. So I just want to dive in. My first question is like, why this book? What inspired it, and why now? Do you want to?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out.
The mic.
Thank you for coming out. It's really wonderful seeing all your faces out there. Why this book? Actually, when I sat down to write this book, it was going to be a totally different book. I was taking a character from my first book, Daughters of the Stone, and giving her her own story. And my process is I get up, I meditate, I take notes. In my meditation, I talk to my would-be characters. And Paula, who is the main character, I was struggling with this book because I was an English teacher for 30 years, and I pounded into my students, you must write an outline. You must have a direction. And I tried and I tried, and it didn't work. It felt wooden and inauthentic. And one day, my main character, Paula, showed up in my meditation, and she said, when are you going to stop writing the story you want to tell and writing the story that's my story? And I said, and what is your story? And little by little, I started focusing on the story not told. And we've all heard about women who were used as breeders, but that's about where it ends. They were used as breeders. And I started thinking about, what does that really mean? What does that feel like? What does that taste like? What does that look like where after you've spent 9 months carrying a child and giving birth to a child, it is immediately taken away and sold, and you will never see your children again? And it happened repeatedly. And I thought, you know, she's right. That's a better story than a story I wanted to tell. And that's where this book comes from, is trying to get into the body and mind of a woman who we see in the shadows of history but has never been given permission to be herself. And so this is where my book comes from.
Oh, that's great. I will continue, though, with the whole theme of our stories not being told. So I was that kid who escaped to the library as a sanctuary. Thank you so much for being a librarian. I love librarians so much. To escape a home where I felt trapped, a place where I felt othered, all of those things. And flashbulb memory, I was about 11 years old, sitting amongst the stacks, sitting and looking up at all the books, and that's where I'm in my happy place. And then I just suddenly just realized that I wasn't there. We weren't there. And I looked at the names on the spines, I looked at everything, and I was like, oh my God, we're not here. This is, what's wrong, right? So instantly when you're a kid, you're like, well, what's wrong with me? But then I said, there's nothing wrong with me. We should be there. So I'm just stubborn. So fast forward 40 years. I was like, I'm going to get this done if it kills me. Because I really do believe, like I saw when I hosted my show, a bunch of young women would come up to me, Black and Latino women, and say, I can do this. And now some of them are anchoring local, some of them are producers, and it's wonderful. So I just want to see, in the end, you know, decades forward, my book buried under a stack of books from people like us.
That's amazing. That was your experience as well. Like, I think I've seen somewhere you were mentioning as well that you didn't see yourselves on the bookshelf.
Absolutely not. Not only did I not see myself, I mean, when I was a kid, I was sent to live with my grandmother, and these women were telling stories all the time. And when I came back to New York, I wanted to see the stories. And I watched TV, and I went to the movies, and I also haunted the libraries. And my stories were never there, never. Much later, I'm watching All in the Family, and this character, Julio, turns up. And I loved Julio because Julio was cursing up a storm in Spanish, and nobody knew what he was saying. And I couldn't wait. I could care less about Archie and Edith, but Julio had my attention. And then when I got to college, I read my first novel by a Afro-Puerto Rican writer in English, Pee-wee Thomas's Down These Mean Streets, which was a great memoir, but it still wasn't my life. It was about his life in the streets and how he survived on the street. Meanwhile, I'm the kid who, you know, her parents get up at, 6 o'clock in the morning. Her mother cooked dinner before she went to work to make sure when I got home, the food was there. Everybody I knew was going out to work and coming home and taking care of their families. Yeah, the street people were there, and yes, I could see them. But that wasn't my story. That was their story. And so I said, well, A, we need a story about Puerto Ricans who are just plain ordinary people. And B, we need to tell it from the woman's point of view, because nobody's asking the women what they think. So yeah, for me, it's really important to tell the story not told.
And our stories are just American stories. And that's what always killed me, is that these were just, when you say, plain normal people, with the richest stories that should be just as elevated, that should be in those stacks, because our stories are just, I've always just been like, well, we're just Americans. This is an American story. Why aren't we hearing it? And it just made no sense to me. So just changing it.
Yeah, like in a way, if you're part of it, why you don't exist? Why are you being erased? Why you're not, your story is not being heard?
We were erased, we were voiceless and faceless. Because I can't tell you how many times people have said, you don't look Puerto Rican.
Oh, yeah.
Well, now we have the term Afro-Latino and Afro-Puerto Rican, but back then, the black kids just thought, oh, you just don't want to be black. And it wasn't that. It was that I was a coin with two sides, and only one side was being recognized. And so I really felt it was important to show the diversity of any country, any culture. So there are black Chinese and black Italians, and and so somewhere we need to acknowledge that these people exist.
I'm right here. No, just kidding.
I didn't.
No, I'm just joking. I'm being funny. But yes, that's the thing, is that when I say typical American story, I mean, immigrants make up such a huge part of this country. And when I looked around my neighborhood when I was a little kid, we were all different colors. We were all Dominican, Chinese, Chino, Latino, all different colors. And that was normal. And I think, as the years went by, it just became more and more normal, and the world outside. And then I traveled, and I was like, this is amazing. This is normal. And we should be out there. So yeah, there we go.
No, and I also think it's amazing the way you've done it in both of your work, because another thing that happens is, like, whenever we think about Latino, we think about a very specific culture, right? We all eat tortillas, and that's not true. Then on the other hand, I think we can see a lot of representation, as you said. No, not a lot of representation. We can see ourselves being represented, as you said, like, the neighborhood, the ones that are involved in crime. Or the other side of that coin is also when we see the representation that it's only this culture that is forever happy, everyone dancing salsa. And I know so many people that cannot dance and are part of my country.
No rhythm. Oh, yes. When I was young and going to clubs, I would just check out the whole place before I agreed to dance with anybody, because too many of my toes were just totally bruised by no rhythm people who thought they could dance.
But they dance so good in the movies. It's shocking. We need to go and find them where they are. I think in general your lives have been in movement, and this shows in your work. Crossing of languages, cultures, cities, countries, and ultimately assimilation or resistance. Can you elaborate on the tension between keeping the self versus the powerful forces that try to erase who we are? In which ways you or your characters resisted or ultimately assimilated?
I tell you, nothing like moving from Harlem to New Hampshire in the late 70s to really smack you in the head with assimilation. I was asked this recently about, like, how do I feel about it? Because I think that this is important, because we talk about it very culturally, but I like to speak and write very personally and emotionally about it. To me, it's a pretty violent theft. You know, when my mother remarried Anglo-American, we weren't allowed to speak Spanish in the house, listen to Spanish music, TV, food. Everything I had known, even Chinese too, was gone. And it made me unable to speak to my abuela in her last days, who was my most treasured person, first person in my life to take care of me. And I find it to be so damaging, because you can be part of many cultures. I think that the majority culture for a long time thought that that wasn't possible. In order to be American, you must be of this, right? Well, here we are. And it's actually, this is very American. And that's why I deeply believe that you can still retain yourself. I did end up losing a big part of myself, and I had to go and do all the work to find myself again. I had a lot of disappointments. I tried to move back to my old neighborhood. I found that the Dominican community then rejected me because I was too white. I found, I could go to Chinatown. They didn't believe I was trying, there was just everywhere I went, it was, you're not this enough, you're not that enough, you're not that. And it really forced me to sit there and say, what and who am I? And I need to sit in that very comfortably, even if it morphs a little bit over time. But I think assimilation is really painful thing if it's forced on you, for sure.
Well, when I read your book, I was fascinated by it. Assimilation was never an issue in my life. Nobody ever said, I thought you were white. That never came up. But I think the big difference was my parents were firmly rooted in the Latino community. There was no question of my not being Puerto Rican. Absolutely not. And I don't think of assimilation as a positive word, because it immediately gives priority to one culture over another. And I feel that I am a hybrid, that I am so equal parts Black, Puerto Rican, and in my attitude, the way I carry myself in the world, very American as well. So when I go to Puerto Rico, people say, oh, she's Americuchi, she and I have learned to behave differently in different situations. So when I am in Puerto Rico, I never walk into any space without acknowledging who is there before me. So you walk in, buenos dias, como está usted, blah, 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 you pass the time of day, then you get around to ordering whatever you're gonna order, or buying whatever you're gonna buy. When you're in a restaurant and everybody's eating and you get up and walk away, or you enter the space, you say buen provecho, and you acknowledge that people need to receive the nourishment that they're getting so that they can be healthy. And those little tiny differences make a big difference. When I was a kid, of course, I wanted to fit in. And I remember when I was a kid, there used to be a show on called The Waltons. And at the end of The Waltons, everybody said, good night, John, good night. One night I decided to say to my mom, good night, Mom. And she stopped me cold. What is this good night? No, it's bendición. And you ask for my blessing before you go to sleep, because you don't know if you're going to wake up, and you need to be blessed before you fall asleep. At that point, I felt, oh, she's being old-fashioned again. But you know what? Now that she's not here, I wish I could say, bendición, mami. Because that would make me fall asleep at times when I can't because of whatever's happening in my life. So for me, assimilation is not a positive. For me, being a hybrid is a positive. And I think that most Americans are hybrids of one thing or another. It doesn't have to be race. But I think when we embrace that, we become a much richer tapestry. And I love rich tapestries.
One more note on that one. Let's just call it what it is. It's supremacy.
Yeah.
Because when I was a little kid, and you know, the white kids in school, or even my stepfather's making me feel bad for being who I am. No, you must do it this way. You must do it that way. What does that communicate? It communicates that what you're doing and who you are is bad. It's wrong. It's lesser than. So the damage isn't just taking away. It's what is it giving you? What is it telling you? It's telling you that you're less of a human being.
And now that you mentioned that, I think it's also interesting. I think both of you experienced at school that they told you like you were not good enough to go to college, or right? Do you want to make some comments on that, since you just brought that in? And I thought it was interesting that it was both your experiences.
You mean the nuns in school thinking that my little baby sister on my hip was my baby? Hilarious. In high school? No, they actually discouraged me. Even though my grades, I was like number 2 in the class, and I still didn't get salutatorian because they didn't like my attitude. So I was blocked out of that, and they said, no, you can't apply to these great schools because, I listened a little bit because it was frustrating. But I'll just say 2 things. One is I did end up being that kid that did things in spite. I would rather, and I have become a person who does things regardless of spite. Like, it's not the spite, right? It's on you. If you think I'm done, that's you. That's not me, that's you. But when I was a kid, I was very much like, oh, I'll show you. Oh, I'll show you. And it was this constant like one-upping. However, back at home, you better believe I was not allowed to bring home anything but A's. So it's not like it was just that. It was the fear of death and dismemberment. But it felt so good. I had a passage that somebody tweeted yesterday from the book. This Catholic school I ended up going to in New Hampshire was French Canadian, so I had to take 8 years of French. Ça va? And, which took my Spanish away. But anyway, I was pronouncing things. There was like a vocabulary. They had to see how you pronounce. They were very particular about how you pronounce your French. And it was the final exam. And you walk with the nun outside while she listens to you read. Let me tell you, I nailed that so hard. Because I grew up not only with English, my first language was Spanish, and Mandarin, several other dialects, and here I am, French, please. And the look on her face, I lapped it up like it was ice cream. Like, for me as a kid, it just felt so good. And I learned a bad lesson, which was like, ooh, I like that feeling. But then I realized, of course, as you get older, you realize, well, then that puts your self-worth in someone else's hands.
That's true.
And so spite became no longer my motivation. But to your point, nobody thought I would go to college, let alone graduate school, let alone everything else I've ever done.
Write books, like
be a professor, all of that, have a TV show, like nobody. And that's fine, but I didn't really care once I left New Hampshire. I didn't care what they thought. I was just doing it for myself.
And I think your mom had a very specific reaction to.
Right. I was told that I wasn't college material, and so my guidance counselor refused to send my transcripts to 4-year schools, and she said, you would be a great secretary, so I'm sending your transcripts to community colleges. And I went to a community college for 2 years. But I went home and I said to Mom, the guidance counselor says that I'm not college material. And my mother said, you go back and you tell your guidance counselor that it's not about whether or not you're going to college. The question is, which college are you going to go to? And so if you're going to go to a community college, that's fine. That's laying a foundation, which is wonderful. But then you need to do something else. You need to move from there. So 4 years later, when I graduated cum laude from the school that I wanted to go to initially, that they told me I could never get into, I wanted to go back and say, look, person, look what I did. And then I realized as much as that hurt, that woman probably did more to keep me in school than anybody else, because she made me so angry in undervaluing me that whenever I thought, I don't want to get up to go to this 8 o'clock class, I saw her face. And I got up and I went to the 8 o'clock class. And if it had been a 7 o'clock class, I would have gone to the 7 o'clock class, because I wanted so hard to prove to her that she was wrong. My mom was not a person who could be easily diverted from her intent.
Same.
Well, too bad they are not here today, so you could sign their books.
No, thank you.
But we are here today celebrating you.
Yes. Well, I thought you were talking about those awful people. That's why I was like, no, thank you.
I think both your books are told from the perspective of women, and I think they present many strong women that endure different challenges. One of the things I think you both focus is also the themes of motherhood from very different perspectives. And it includes also, you make many reference, Carmen Rita, to Virgin Mary in contrast to your mom and other experiences. And then Dahlma, you have the powerful figure of Yemaya in your work. Can you speak a little bit about that experience, telling the stories from the woman experience, the experience of even through other through religions that are not recognized in your case as much in the US, but are so important in the Caribbean experience and in the African experience. And then also in your case, like all your experiences. Can you speak a little bit about motherhood, womanhood, and what you're trying to do through your work?
My book wouldn't exist without the whole idea of motherhood, because the whole reason that I have the question, had to answer the question and the mystery, was my mother's choices, right? She was the one carrying the secret. The whole reason why she had to carry the secret, the situation that she was in, being married off to Chinese gangster at 19, and then getting out of that relationship, and then marrying Anglo-American just to get out of her situation, and then feel trapped again. It all ties into womanhood, and me observing her life being absolutely miserable, trapped in domesticity, but in what the culture had told her was the thing to do. She had thought that, by constantly kind of elevating herself through relationships or marriages, that she was getting closer and closer to, the utmost of what women should do and be. And also she treated me, I was the oldest girl, and then my older brother, and she treated us very differently, which I found, of course, incredibly unfair. He had 2 arms and 2 legs. Why couldn't he also, help me with the dishwasher? That sort of thing. And it was very much, she pushed me as if I was a boy. She said, you have all the advantages of this country. This is why I'm working. This is why I'm doing this. You need to get ahead. But I still had to do all the domestic as well. So I had to do all of that, and he got away with that. So that was not good. But in terms of, religion, she ended up in the end, unfortunately, becoming evangelical. And it creates a lot of barriers between you and people that you love or you want to love, because then everything became about judgment. Everything for me was about judgment, and tithing, not giving enough to her in the jar, which I actually called her tip jar, because I don't know where that money went. And religion in that way played a huge role, and the Catholic school and all of that. But it was a scary thing. And because I saw her kind of morphing all the time, it was unstable. And it made me a lot less likely to, even though as a little kid, I had a little altar in my room. Yeah, I know. She's like, a little altar that I made with, like, because that's my abuela's house. We all have altars, right? And she also had an altar, with the cigar, when abuelo died. And I just was confused by it, and it made me question a lot of things. and then I ended up on the board of Planned Parenthood Federation. And so it just, she wasn't around for that. But if she were, my gosh, she'd be so angry. And yet she had used that ability, that choice herself many times, which led to why I'm here and why I didn't know who my father was. All that is long, convoluted thing to say is that religion was kind of like a specter, like a big cloud that kind of, was it here, was it not? Should I follow it, should I not? Where's the role of women in this religion? All the nuns, the sisters. I was so sad to see all the richness of the Catholic Church. And these nuns, for Christmas and the holidays, they say, what do you want to give the teachers for a present? And he said, soap and socks and hose. And I was like, what? Like, how could you not? Yet the priests I saw had these incredible, like, homes and beautiful and marble and all that. So I guess I could say, since I was little, it was really clear to me that all of this was very unfair. And I
especially
could
to
be
women.
to women. That's what I mean. Yes,
Yeah.
to women. It was very unfair, and I really spent the rest of my life like that. Fuels me like nothing else. This complete unfairness. I believe in our full and whole humanity, even if you are part of religion. I still, to this day, and by the way, yes, my mother used to bless me too at night because she could do things, Latin things. She could do Dominican things in secret. See, if our father wasn't around, she would do it, right? So at night, she would come and bend to on us. To this day, my daughter makes fun of me because when I get in the car to drive, and I don't practice anything, but I still, it is culture.
Cultural.
It is such a culture. She's like, first time she saw me, she was like, Mommy, what are you doing? And I'm like, okay, 3 more times. She's like, what? I said, Mommy did that all the time. She never got in an accident. She's the worst driver in the world. So I do every time. So it is. It's in our blood. It's in part of like who we are. It's in part of the culture. But I refuse to internalize the gender part of the religion that I grew up with.
Okay. What's the question? No. Two-part question: religion and motherhood. Motherhood is always really important in my novels. As I said, A Woman of Endurance is the second in a series of books, but motherhood is important in my neo-slave narrative or historical fiction, whichever way you want to put it, because so many black women lost their mothers during the time of enslavement. Families were torn apart, were sold to different people. All kinds of ways of losing one's mother, and then who was there to mother you? And I think to this day, black families, whether Latino or American or European, whatever, have all these mother figures. So maybe mom isn't there, but madrina is there, and godmother is there, and mother-in-law may be there. And we have all these older women who take up the role of mother when mother isn't there. So in A Woman of Endurance, there are many, many, many mother figures, kind of to balance out all the mothers who lost their babies one way or the other. In fact, there's a trinity of mothers in there, and very consciously using the Catholic construct of 3 to support what comes later. So there's that. In terms of Yemaya, Yemaya is the Yoruban goddess of sexuality and procreation and attraction, and each one of my books has a different orisha or a different goddess ruling it. In this one, it's Yemaya, who is the goddess of the ocean as well. And the main character has some very conflicting feelings about this, in terms of Yemaya brought me here, brought me from Africa to this place, which is a hell. But at the same time, She gave me a daughter. She gave me surrogate daughters. She made me a daughter. So there are all kinds of push and pull images. But I believe that one of the reasons that Black culture, African culture has survived is because of their religion. Because regardless of what country in the Americas you are, there is a type or a form of African religion that incorporates deities that rule over nature. And that is something that cannot be taken away from someone. You can enslave somebody's body. You can capture somebody's body. You cannot take their soul and their belief and their, I don't want to say abstraction, but their, I guess the best way to say it is faith, although faith often implies a European religion. In this case, it doesn't, but a faith that there is something beyond this, and that the ancestors walk with you. And that sense exists in the Caribbean, as Espiritismo in Puerto Rico, as Santeria in Cuba, and in the South, it's certainly, when people talk about working roots and doing all these other things, there is a sense of we are not here alone. And I think that is the thing that allowed us to survive through all the brutality and all the violence of the times in slavery and in times of today when there's so much hate that has been legitimized. So I think that there's that sense. There certainly is that sense in me that my ancestors walk with me and that I speak for them when they were never given a chance to speak for themselves.
Yeah, and at the end, it's a resistance, right? Like just keeping and the faith, the beliefs, and despite what assimilation is trying to say.
Right. Resistance doesn't necessarily mean a gun or,
Yes.
you know, there are all kinds of resistance.
Yes, yes. Dahlma, you wrote a historical novel, as you were mentioning now. How was that research process? Because I think, well, before that, the ending of your book is beautiful.
A Woman of Endurance.
Yes, A Woman of Endurance. You have to read it. It's just beautiful.
We're not going to tell you about the ending.
No, we're not going to tell you. But I have like the image in my head so vivid. Okay, so going back to this, you wrote this novel, and it's a historical novel, and I think even growing up, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and even in our history books, there was not enough of this. Like we don't have this information necessarily. Well, we don't have it unless we actively try to look for it. So I wonder, how was that experience for you of doing all the research and finding all of this to write the novel?
It took many years. I think that there wasn't really a concerted effort to look into the lives of enslaved people until the 70s, and even then it was very limited. I realized that doing traditional research was not going to work, because when I went to primary sources were created by slave owners and the powers that be. So where was I going to find the voice of the enslaved people? Well, my husband and I went to Puerto Rico repeatedly and looked for the oldest people we could find and asked them what their grandparents and great-grandparents told them about their lives. That was really helpful. I also, as we moved on, historians have paid more attention, although still not enough. We visited every sugarcane plantation that we could, restored ones and ruins. And I was surprised that, you know, at one point, I am in Puerto Rico, it's 98 degrees, and the man is saying, you have to wear long pants and sweat socks and high-top sneakers. And I couldn't figure out why. Well, we had to go through all this dense forest to get to the ruins of some of the plantations, and to protect my feet and my legs, he had asked me to wear this stuff. And some of the research was incredible. For instance, here I grew up in New York City, right? So I figured, okay, sugarcane cutters, they have machetes and they cut. I had no idea there were 300 different types of machetes, okay? The plantation overseer had what we consider a machete, a long, thin blade, which is very sharp. There is no way in the world that we're going to give a captive that weapon, right? So if you look at the sugarcane cutters, their machetes were thicker so that they could get through the sugarcane stalks, and they were blunt so that they couldn't stab anybody with them. And I had no idea. So sometimes when you do research, you have to be there. You have to see it, you have to touch it. Things that you never thought of, you know. I had to do a lot of research into what kind of plants midwives used in the 1800s during labor. You know, what kind of, it wasn't a hospital room, what kind of room did women have to deliver in? What were the other women doing at that time? How long did it take? So it was a lot, excuse me, a lot of different kinds of research, medicinal plants, religious practices, right? How does a woman who is a healer choose to find plants that are not so healing to teach someone a lesson? How do, you know, I have a character who is a black albino, which sounds like, you know, impossible, but yes, a black albino who felt, I'm whiter than white people. Why am I a slave? You know? So there are any number of, I met with urban archaeologists, I met with architects, I met with historians, I met with people who said, oh, don't bother looking at textbooks, go to court records and find out what enslaved people brought to court to try and get justice for something or another. I still have so much to research. There's still so much to find. It's there, but it takes a tremendous amount of work, time, and energy to find it.
Thank you. Well, the audience, if anyone has a question, you can step to the mic so we can hear you. And while the audience is getting ready, your research was quite different for your book, right? I don't want you to feel like you have to say anything that reveals information, because you also have to read her book.
Yeah, you think you know the surprise, but you don't know the surprise. I didn't know the surprise until I was in edits, and the last surprise came to me. The big part of research too is because, you know, I had to do a lot of that in my professional life. Some of it is discovery, it's luck. Things drop in your lap. And for me, it was 2 years of being a genealogist, detective, and going to old newspaper records and the young lords, because I supposedly at one point he was a doctor in the hospital in the Bronx, you know, that they had taken over. It was just constant that. Genealogy, hiring genealogists who couldn't find anything, and then luck, right? Because I couldn't trust what was told to me, even when my mother was dying. She had the opportunity, I gave it to her, and she took it to her grave, told me another story. So in the end, it was really just timing. And to your point, even though I'm not religious, I always feel like these things happen for a reason. And my other research was 15 years of weekly therapy. No, I'm serious. I could not be the person. I could not. Even when I couldn't afford therapy, I was deep in psychology books because I had to figure out why I was in so much pain and what was missing. There was something missing in my life so deep and so strong. I had to dig into myself because that's all I had to find out what it was, because I was destroying myself. I was marrying people I shouldn't have married. I was doing things I shouldn't have done. I was so sick all the time. And I needed to figure that out. So that was actually a really big part of research, and a big part of, knowing who you are isn't just, walking around being like, I want an Afro-Latina, Chinese, queer, da-da-da-da. No, it's who are you? You have to be curious about yourself. So that took a lot of work on myself to figure all of that out. And it feels good, by the way. Feels good.
I also have to say that sometimes you don't like what you find.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? Sometimes you really don't like what you find. But if you're going to be authentic, you have to say it's part of the mix. You know what I mean? It may not be the dominant part, but it's part of the mix. And every negative thing is a learning experience. And so my characters would say to you, there were no accidents. There is no luck. There is the universe putting things in your head. So
I believe it. I believe it.
Any questions from the audience? Yes. Can you go to the mic, please? It's right there.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine.
So I guess my question would be more for Carmen Rita. Have you been able to reach a point of forgiveness towards your parents and been able to reconcile the distrust and betrayal? Like, did you ever feel pressure to just forgive and forget because of the way we often put mothers on, like, pedestals? Like, you can't ever say anything bad about them.
Yeah, I've been asked a lot about how I write about my mother, though you note, like, there's no villains in my story, right? As much trauma and abuse and horrible things that happen, there are no villains. I really want to treat everybody as a human being. I do get asked a lot, do I forgive? No. And then the first reaction is like, what? Oh, she's a bad person. No. Here's what I do. To me, as I understand forgiveness, as I understand it, it has the word give in it. It's something you are giving to the person who has harmed you, right? In order for me to give somebody that, they need to be sorry. They need to know what they've done. They need to acknowledge it. They need to change their behavior. None of my parents did that or have done that. But is my empathy there and my understanding, and that's what I needed to find peace? I have peace because I empathize with the situation she was in, the time she was in, the circumstances she was under, the generational trauma passed down generation after generation from the slave trade all the way in the Dominican, the Caribbean, all the way down. No joke, that is real, and it's epigenetic, and we have to work really hard. So I love my mother. I didn't talk to her for years before she died. I don't know if I'd be talking to her now if she was around. She's very happy. She's on the cover of the book. I know that. For sure, because that's Lupe. But I don't think necessarily that makes me a bad person because I don't forgive. No, I'm at peace. And I love her and I get her. And in the end, you know what? I would want somebody to get me too. Right? So that's it. For me, the goal was peace.
So a comment and a question. I got a call from Carmen when she realized who she didn't know her father was. She called me.
Don't say anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, she was like, I think it's this, but it's something else. And the reason why it's important is that sometimes when it's like an out-of-body experience, when you're like, wait, I remember the call. It's this, but it's something else. So yeah, there's no embellishing there. And she wouldn't do that. So that.
Thanks.
My mother was born in a house, no hospital, and my great-grandfather worked in the sugar plantation in Guanica.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to include Patricia. When we were little, we were not Afro-Boricuas because the color of our skin, Afro-Boricua when we were little was you, was my mother and my grandmother. And so when I talk to friends who are black, independent of where they're from, they say, Hispanic, Latinx, Latine. I don't care because I'm black and I don't have the benefit of just not being black. So my question to you is, do you think this term, I will never call myself Afro-Latina. I just won't, because growing up, I had the privilege of this complexion. So do you think it's an important political statement for Latinas and Puerto Ricans of my complexion to say I'm Afro-Latina? Or is it a bit of like, stay in your lane because you're not? Because you have the benefit on Monday of being Afro-Latina, but Tuesday you can code switch and be something else, and you don't have that benefit. So all that to say is, do you think that women of my complexion saying we're Afro-Latina helps you? Or it's a bit of like, just stay in your lane because you're not?
What I believe is that everybody has the right to call their name. If you feel you're Afro-Latina, then you're Afro-Latina. There are many, my God, so many gradations of color within the Latino world, and not just Latino world, also African American, and gradations of blackness, period, wherever it is. I think historically, oppressors have used that gradation to separate us. So I appreciate the people who acknowledge the commonality. I also appreciate people like yourself who say, I know I can get indoors that you can't get into by the mere fact that I look a particular way. I think this is a very complex society. At my age, which is advanced, if someone tells me they are green, they are green. You know why? Because in fact, whatever that person thinks they are or believes they are has nothing to do with me. I don't have a horse in that race, you know what I mean? It took me long enough to say, this is who I am. I don't care what you think you see. This is who I am. So I don't go around telling other people who they are. I wait and let them define themselves, and I don't prejudge because I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like when somebody said to me, oh, you can't be Puerto Rican because Puerto Ricans are white and Dominicans are black, so you must be a Dominican who's passing. Now, here you have a Dominican and a Puerto Rican. So
Welcome.
I don't I don't know what history class that person took, but I think that they had a little
And the
problem.
Dominicans would say, no, I'm Spanish.
Well, I'm not even going there. But I think that, as I said, the beauty of America, and I include all of the Americas, is that we are such a rich tapestry. Why would we take away a gift that we have been given?
What a beautiful way to end this.
I love that.
Thank you so much for being here,
you so much.
both
Thank
of you. It was amazing to have you here. Thank you everyone for being here.